Namaste, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Pushpita Prasad. I'm on the board of the Coalition of Hindus of North America, and we are very excited to welcome you here today for a discussion on yoga. Timing is fortuitous because International Yoga Day is right around the corner, and we thought what better time than to really look at this concept that is so central to Hindu philosophy and Hindu thinking, and is probably one of Hinduism's most popular exports in the world today, and yet very many would have a problem associating Hinduism with it. So we will talk about that more late in a minute. But a quick blurb about the Coalition of Hindus of North America. We are an advocacy and education group based out of Canada and the United States of America. And we have a volunteer basis all across the country, and we focus heavily on educating parents, children, middle schoolers, high schoolers, and then at making sure Hindu voices and concerns are reflected in legal policies, lawmaking, corporates, and other stake places around the country. So, without further ado, I'd love to introduce Sneha Rao, who is going to be talking to us today about this very important topic of yoga: is stewardship versus ownership. Sneha is a first generation Hindu immigrant who moved to the US when she was 13. She has worked as an engineer and a data scientist in the aviation business for over a decade before transitioning to study Hinduism, yoga, Hinduphobia, and decoloniality. Her transition was propelled when she became a mother and started thinking about how she wanted to raise her daughter, when she deeply examined the ways in which the culture she was growing up in can be harmful to Hindu children, and made very specific efforts to reconnect to her Hindu roots. As a teenager growing up in the US, Sneha had struggled personally with issues of Hindu phobia and assimilation into the larger American culture, and she found strength in motherhood to learn more deeply and engage more deeply with yoga and dharmic philosophy. She's finding that Hindu phobia and appropriation of Hindu culture deeply affected her as a teenager growing up in the US. And so she started, like any good activist, started articulating and writing about these issues on her social media and other publications such as the Shaktitva Foundation Journal, American Kahani, etc. Sneha has co-founded the Hindus for Decolonization group on Facebook, which is a place to really create a space for decolonizing Hindu voices. And she's dedicated to raising awareness about Hindu phobia and developing scholarship on these issues. So, very excited to welcome you, Sneha. And why don't you tell us about your talk today?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me here. It's an honor. Should we just go into the presentation?
Yeah.
I have about a 15-minute intro presentation, and then just so sort of we can frame this topic because there's a lot that's going on.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. So it is a deep topic, and we'll have more slides than we normally do in our talk. But I was fascinated by your presentation, and I think our audience will love it too. So over to you.
Thank you. So thank you all for coming to this presentation. I just want to start by offering the Shanti mantra. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunatu Saviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you again all for joining us today for this talk. Again, I want to thank CoHNA for hosting me. It's an honor to be invited. The first thing I would like to do is define what exactly is yoga appropriation and situate the discourse in the West. So, what exactly is cultural appropriation? The problem of cultural appropriation is not in the desire to participate in aspects of a different culture that you admire. The problem of cultural appropriation is primarily linked to the power imbalance between the culture doing the appropriating and the culture being appropriated. That power imbalance allows the culture being appropriated to be distorted and redefined by the dominant culture and siphons any material or financial benefit of that piece of culture away to the dominant culture, while marginalized cultures are still persecuted for living that culture. Even if a culturally appropriative act means to respect culture, it cannot if it can understand and respect the past and present power dynamics defining that culture's interaction with the dominant culture. This definition, I really liked it, and I learned it from Ijeoma Oluo. And what she's really speaking about is how Black culture is appropriated by the dominant white culture in the US. Hairstyles, music, fashion, dance, and spiritual traditions rooted in Black culture and struggles for survival are constantly appropriated, distorted, and redefined by the dominant culture to generate monetary and material value for the mainstream white culture, while Black people suffer disproportionate poverty, criminalization, imprisonment, and hypersexualization within the system. I.e., despite Black culture having a deep impact on American culture at large, the people whose history and struggles form that culture have not benefited from mainstreaming of their culture. Excuse me. Think about how Elvis Presley appropriated Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog, which exploded his career while Black artists remained shut out of the mainstream white radio stations. Or how Miley Cyrus appropriated twerking, a dance that originated in Afro-Caribbean culture, while perpetuating the harmful trope of hypersexualized Black women. You can see similar trends in the way yoga is appropriated. Yoga has become conflated with asana. Asana becomes narrowly defined with fitness, and fitness becomes narrowly defined as Eurocentric beauty standards for thin white women. The divine feminine becomes exotified and hypersexualized. Hindu symbols like tilaks, trishuls become commodities, so white women who wear them can signal their own bohemianness. Though Hindu culture does not reject fitness and beauty, sexuality, or free markets, we hold yoga as a practice that is sacred to achieve samadhi, moksha, or the divine. True yogic values of oneness with the divine, self-realization, are not available in the Western mainstream culture. In all these examples, it's the dominant white cultural values and not yogic values that have prevailed. To understand why this is happening, we need to understand history and examine the relationship of dominance. If you remember the definition, it's not that white culture cannot appreciate our culture, it's that they don't respect the history of those interactions. So I'm just going to go into some of that history now. First of all, let's start with what happened to the Indian education system, the Hindu education system. The ancient Gurukul system imparted education to a wide array of Indian peoples, which included yogic education. In 1813, Britain passed the Charter Act, which lays the foundation for English education in the colonies. In 1835, Maculay recommends an English education system at the exclusion of all dharmic knowledge, as he wishes to form a class of persons Indian in blood and color, and English in taste, opinions, and morals, and in intellect. Excuse me. British implement the Minute education system, destroying the dharmic education system. Some Gurukuls do survive to the present day, but access is limited and knowledge of yoga too has become limited. In 1871, the British passed the Criminal Tribes Act, which criminalizes sadhus and sannyasis who have been traditionally the stewards of yogic knowledge. Yogis are specifically targeted because they had historically participated in resistance against the British and Mughal colonizers and had routinely participated in raiding the East India Company. They traveled all over India and spread Hindu yogic knowledge, which was threatening the British missionaries. They were monetarily supported by the Hindu people with donations, and that meant less taxes for the British. So we can see in the previous example that the institutional support for yoga was systematically destroyed in its land of origin amongst Hindus. So what's happening in the US? In the US, the Theosophical Society, an influential spiritual reform group founded in New York City in 1875. While they were very intent on learning all they could about spiritual traditions of the East, their dabbling was seen as sinful activities in the American media and drew a lot of controversy. The Theosophists were themselves split the public's perception of yoga into two parts: Raja Yoga good, Hatha Yoga bad, and even immoral. Half of those Hatha holy men in India sitting like catatonics on beds of nails like fakers, they said, and even Mark Twain dissed these ascetics as performers who took money from the poorest of families. So while our education system, our institutions were being destroyed, the Theosophical Society was defining what yoga is, what is good yoga, bad yoga for a Western audience. However, they were very influential, and they encouraged Hindu gurus like Swami Vivekananda, Paramahansa Yogananda to travel to the West to teach yoga and Vedanta in the late 19th and 20th century. For their part, the gurus that traveled here were seeking for ways to help Indian people who were suffering greatly under the boot of the British. They were making a case to humanize Indians in the minds of the West. However, as a reaction to the influx of foreign ideas and Hindu gurus, and the American press often published articles and op-eds which presented Hinduism and yoga as degenerate tradition and Hindus as uncivilized. Here are just a few examples. Maculay is associated with torture. Yoga is associated with transgressive scandals and corruption. However, white entrepreneurs were still trying to materially benefit from selling yoga classes. This era ended with the Asian Exclusion Act that prohibited Hindus and Asians from all over from traveling or immigrating to the US. This stopped the inflow of Hindu gurus, and white yogis like Indra Devi dominated the yoga space and sold yoga to the rich and famous Hollywood celebrities. Only white practitioners dominated at this time. The immigration ban was lifted after civil rights in the 1960s. The period right after the immigration ban is lifted in the 1960s, there's a new explosion of East-West encounters in the US, with the free love era of feminism, anti-war movements taking shape. Hindu gurus start traveling to the US, and influential celebrities like the Beatles travel to India to learn from gurus. So you can see, this is an image from a paper that I'm going to cite here, called Patanjali to Gospel of Sweat. You can see the early era, 1975, there's a lot of pictures of gurus. They feature Ramdas and people practicing pranayama and people practicing meditation. Alas, this is not going to last. The study by Kamal Munir showed that Hinduism was untethered starting in the 1990s. His paper examined articles in the Yoga Journal from 1975 to 2016 and showed that over time, Hindu gurus were silenced in favor of pushing fitness-based yoga classes. Now, if you look at the same image in the 2000s on the bottom here, all the images are about fitness-based yoga classes. In the early era, Hinduism was often mentioned and even spoken about, but by 2000, all mentions of Hinduism had vanished. In this image, you can see the solid line shows how Hinduism was often mentioned early, and then it essentially goes to zero by 2000s. Meanwhile, the dotted dashed line takes off, and that's the fitness line. So fitness becomes a dominant thing, followed very closely by health. This is when Hindu American Foundation wrote a letter to the Yoga Journal asking why Hinduism wasn't being represented anymore. And they responded that Hinduism had too much baggage. That baggage was all the Hindu phobia that had prevailed in the Western media through the 19th and 20th century. Now, efforts like International Yoga Day by Hindus and Indians to reclaim yoga are read often today as Hindutva propaganda. The mere mention of yoga's roots in Hinduism pushed claims of Hindu nationalism couched in the language of diversity and inclusion. Here is an example of a very influential yoga personality, Susanna Barkataki, who's of South Asian descent and has a very large following on Instagram, and also her webpage gets a lot of following. And she has she's very influential in the global yoga certification organization called Yoga Alliance. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Her message here is that it is wrong for Hindus to ask that yoga's Hindu roots be recognized, as that excludes people from other religions from practicing yoga. But she never acknowledges that the reason monotheistic peoples find practicing a Hindu traditional objectionable is because of their own exclusionary theology. Hindu gurus have offered yogic knowledge freely to sincere seekers since Swami Vivekananda traveled to the Americas. Essentially, the yoga industry claims that they have to save yoga from Hindus in order to be equitable. This is converting Hindu stewardship of yoga to ownership by mostly white Western industry. In order to silence Hindus who protest against this appropriation, Hinduism is often represented as inherently casteist. This is a Birdie article that went around just a few months ago that claimed that how casteism manifests in yoga and why it's a problem. In places like Alabama, yoga is stripped of anything that is perceived as Hindu due to the opposition from fundamentalist Christians. It is secularized so that it can be consumed within the American public schools. This is where Hindu kids, by the way, are learning about yoga in public schools, where they're also learning that Hinduism is casteist and patriarchal. The effect can be devastating for many Hindu children. So, in order to sell yoga to a Western audience, yoga is cleaved from a source tradition, because recognizing yoga's roots in Hinduism means that the West would have to address the Hindu phobia prevalent in its culture. So instead, its roots are erased, and Hindus who protest are portrayed as Hindu nationalists. Hindu stewardship as yoga is converted to ownership by the yoga industry. I'll pass it over now to the host.
Thank you. I'm a little shocked once again when I see your slides, because I think you hear all these threads and it's not unknown, at least to those of us who follow it. But when you see it all come together, the way you've put it together and the chronological change, I was fascinated by your slide on the covers of the yoga journal. I mean, I think that's just, I just say, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think that just covers it all, that how successfully this transition has happened without most of us even realizing it. I think it's really sad. And I think you touch upon, I think we're very familiar with the commercialization aspect of it, but I had not really picked up that much on how the industry is dominated by a certain body type. That is definitely very interesting. But can you talk a little bit about, when you talk about your historical slides, is there any color you could provide on, how the British obviously had a different view of the yogic practices and the people who practiced it, because they lived what would today be called fairly Bohemian lives. And we have to keep remembering that British rule was very strict Victorian Christian rule, and they objected to a lot of things that they found morally wrong as seen by the Christian worldview. So what was some of the persecution that the yogis in specific faced, or was it more of a depositioning of their art and knowledge?
So they used the Criminal Tribes Act to essentially take these yogic jatis like the Dashnami, Nagasadhus, and the Naths, and they were traveling a lot. and they would also like rely on the general, like the Grihastha Hindus to support them, which was, you know, very accepted part of our tradition and culture. So what they did is they basically said these guys are all criminals, and if they're found traveling anywhere, they would be arrested. And also, like anybody giving them any alms, like it would be seen as a support of criminals. So where Hindus are just like, oh, we're just supporting our sadhus, right? So and the punishment would be very severe. For anybody supporting them, as well as them like asking for alms. So they basically became unsupported peoples, would beg, and some actually did end up, turning to theft. And then, of course, that was then used as proof that, look, they're, really just thieves. So they were really like turned from influential gurus and sadhus who were actually protecting Hindus and Indians to people who were destitute, weren't supported. And I mean, many of their lineages have survived to this day. But it's not because the British weren't trying to eradicate them. It was because we, like Hindus, resisted.
No, I think fascinating reminder on the Criminal Tribes Act. It's amazing how many of us have forgotten about the existence of this act, even though its repercussions affect millions and millions of people living in India, even today, 75 years after it was abolished. So thanks for that. I think there are a couple of questions or comments that came through on your presentation. So, what is or was the Minute education system?
So it's there's a speech that Macaulay gives. It's called the Minute Speech. And it basically there was a huge debate going on between what we call Orientalists, who were sort of pro keeping the education system in India more indigenous, though they had their own like particular ideas of it, and it was very informed by the Enlightenment era. And then you have the Anglicists who didn't want any Hindu dharmic influence at all. And he was an Anglicist, and he came in and he was very like part of the missionary apparatus in Britain. And he argued against having any dharmic education in the British education system that they were setting up for the locals. And he wanted essentially people who were brown but British inside. And, to some extent, he's been very successful. Like his influence is still felt amongst us. And even if you look at post-independence, our so-called freedom fighter, our so-called revolutionaries who then became leaders actually elected to keep that English education system and never reformed it, never decolonized it. So that's still with us today.
Yeah.
You could say that we're still under a Minute education system today.
Hence, of course, the work that groups like yours do around the very important concept of decolonization, something that CoHNA also talks about a lot. Because it's very easy for all of us, we're born and brought up in an independent India or second generation Americans, whatever. But we kind of forget that our education system never really decolonized. And so our minds, to a large extent, still have to make that journey. Some of us make it personally, but it hasn't happened at an institutional level. So I think one of the questions that you talked about, again, in terms of the yoga journal and this whole sort of change that we've seen from a very Hindu view to this kind of very different, focused on women and of women of a certain type, and this whole talk about inclusivity. So how does that make Hinduism more inclusive, right? You obviously say Hinduism is caste, curry, cows. That's an old allegation. But there's also a talk right now about the whiteness of things, and how do we like there is a lot of talk about in diversity circles about whitening and things. So how does appropriation from a culture into a white culture make it more just and inclusive?
Right. That's actually the exact question. So the discourse on appropriation today is very social justice based, which is very identity based, right? It's like South Asians own yoga. Black people own this, that sort of discourse. However, yoga itself, so that itself is a very like white construct, right? Because it's very racialized. And the whole idea of races themselves came out of the Enlightenment culture. And so we have to essentially say for yoga, for us, it's not really about identity. It's about adhikar. It's about gurus passing on the knowledge to sincere seekers who have demonstrated that they have adhikar, have the ability to accept yogic knowledge and not create more harm. So that's really the shift that we need to make in the culture. So what happens is when the discourse is very much about, in the diversity inclusion circles, is about, oh, we need to honor this as a South Asian thing. What does that do for them? It makes it so anybody who's South Asian, whether they're Christian or somebody who's actually actively anti-Hindu or Hindu-phobic, can still own yoga simply because of the attribute of being South Asian. And what that does is it helps the yoga industry maintain that this idea that anything goes in the yoga land. So as long as it's sold by a South Asian person, anything can be sold by yoga. So this is how it benefits yoga land to be very like focused on identity. When you go to a more Hindu like pedagogical approach for yoga, which is through the Guru Shishya Parampara, where you're going to a lineage to learn and you're humbling yourself and you're doing the hard work, that's not really as packageable and sellable, because now you cannot sell anything. You have to make sure that that's the appropriate thing for that lineage, for the teacher, for the guru actually evaluates the student and says, hey, this is an appropriate practice based on where you are in your life and your mental state and in your dharma, right? You have like dharma to your parents, your children. So that's not really as sellable. So their main goal, the yoga industry's main goal, is to maintain this idea that anything goes within yoga. So if you want it to be fitness, it can be fitness. If you want it to be sincere, it can be sincere. However, when you do it from the yogic idea, that is not, it's hard to maintain. So now the identity comes in. Anybody who's South Asian can tell me how to practice yoga, and they'll pick the South Asians who speak, right? They'll allow a Susanna Barkataki to speak, but not a Sneha Rao to speak.
Right.
And so Susanna Barkataki will say whatever they want.
And they'll use them to attack a Sneha Rao.
Exactly.
So that it doesn't come across as racist. But can you develop a little bit more, and I don't know if this is in your next set of slides, a little bit on the concept of adhikara, because I think that is something a lot of us would love to understand more about. Because it's like you said, it's not about having a brown face or being South Asian in origin. I think even historically, everybody living in historical India was not an expert on yoga. It was even in the heyday of the you had to have dedicated some time, effort, humble yourself. You have to get the training and things like that. So just help us understand that concept a little bit more, and how. And I think you have some slides that talk about what the impact or the dilution of that system does, right? And that's one of the topics I really want to dig into, is what does yoga do to you if it's practiced without this holistic ecosystem that it was really part of?
Yeah, sure. So do you want me to go back into the slides really quick?
Sure. If I think they talk about the adhikara issue, right?
Yeah, let me just. So I'll just sort of talk to the adhikara issue really quickly here. Essentially, when the adhikara is not, often people mistake it as an idea that's like exclusionary or elitist. It just means that the guru, right? So you as a shishya, every guru, every text says, the yogic text, I should say, like the Bhagavad Gita, the Hatha Yoga Pradipaka, will say that there's certain qualities that a shishya should have in order to receive yogic knowledge. Gurus like Sri Krishnamacharya have actually specifically said it doesn't matter what your caste is, what your gender is, but don't teach yoga to someone who doesn't have good habits, has envy, has drinks too much, that sort of thing, because that can create actual harm to normal people who are who don't understand these things. And when you don't follow that, you can see that the result of that is, essentially the way that they sell it. And when you're out of that Guru Shishya lineage, you can see that the harm happening. Like you can see, like, hypersexualization of Hindu women, because the way they're selling yoga is exotification. If you remember, I showed you the image of the white woman who was like in a very sexualized pose, and she was presenting that as, divine feminine. So there's a hypersexualization of Hindu women and girls. And you could see that there was, sexual harassment of a female student at UT Austin, where the guy actually, thought it was cool to show a picture of his parts to the girl and say that, do you worship this because she liked Ganesha, right? So that sort of thing is really harmful to us. Another thing is there's a destruction of our yogic pedagogy in order to maintain their ownership of yoga. They're essentially using South Asians to say, that gurus themselves are, killed yoga because people were manipulated, and the teaching itself is dogmatic to have the Guru Shishya lineage. And that's harmful to our own kids, because now they're learning that and they are thinking that they shouldn't go to a guru because it's, dogmatic or whatever, even though many of our gurus are very much open to ideas and help us bring us into that culture of inquiry. So it's actually harmful to us, right? And the yogic perspective is essentially, this is the quote by Sri Krishnamacharya: those who are stubborn, ruffians, those who cheat, who have incorrect food habits, who talk without moral principles, who are sensually addicted, who are cunning, who indulge in bodily pleasures, who betray or destroy others, who have hatred in their hearts, who dislike the scriptures, the Vedas, who drink alcohol or have any bad habits, are unfit to undertake yogic practice, irrespective of caste they belong to. So this includes Brahmins and Kshatriyas too. The reason for this restriction is that even though the science of yoga is pure one, common people will be put in a lot of difficulties due to the cunning nature of these practitioners who may misuse yoga. And then we see that in the culture, where we see there's a rise in white supremacy in Western yoga land. Even though they call it in yoga, they're actually, like, all their data is the Western yogis, right? Yogis, quote unquote. We see that there's people are becoming using meditation techniques, and there's a danger in modern secular yoga where they're becoming detached in a way that isn't appropriate, is harmful. And this is actually coming from a Buddhist guru. And there's also new science that's showing that there's an increase in narcissism, in yoga land, and all their data is on white Western people who are practicing this. So that's a real concern for Hindus. And it's a real demonstration that when you misuse these yogic techniques and teach them to people who don't demonstrate good yogic qualities, there's real harm in that. So I'm just gonna go back to you.
I think that's a fascinating insight, because I think a lot of times we look at the appropriation of yoga from the harm it is doing to, the perception of Hinduism, the Hindu tradition, the loss of our knowledge and our traditions. But I think this is a fascinating filter into the harm it is doing on those who are, or it can do to those who are appropriating it. And I think it just goes to reinforce like what we are finding in a lot of decolonial traditions and a lot of actually what should be part of diversity training is that you can't detach something from the ecosystem and just extract it and hope to still get the benefits of it. These things work as part of an ecosystem, and we see that in so many different areas, whether it's medicine, whether it's food, whether in yogic practices. So this is something I hope that folks like you or other scholars actually spend a little bit more time developing, because I think this is one of the big conundrums that we all deal with, right? Is like, should we just let yoga be and let people do what they want with it? They are doing hell of a crazy number of crazy things with it. Every time you think you've seen it, you see like yet another version. So uh, 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 I think it would be nice if you could like send us even the articles that you referenced, and we can put them in the notes of the YouTube, just so that people can go look up that article. The glass two that you shared were very fascinating to me. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I don't have them with me, but yeah, definitely I
yeah,
can
sure.
forward them and you can send them to your email list or something.
So let's look at the questions that have come in, and there have been a lot. Um, can Sneha ji please elaborate on how terminology like post-lineage yoga is problematic and weaponized by academia to harm Hindus and Hinduism?
Sure. So you've seen that there's been a lot of harm within yoga land, the Western yoga industry. For example, there's like a lot of racism. Many people of color have complained about racism in yoga studios. Um, so there's new scholarship now that has come about by the yoga scholars who are essentially the inheritors of Indology. And what they're saying is, in order to fix yoga, you need to get rid of, you don't need you need to democratize yoga, as in, you don't need lineages anymore. You should just form sanghas of people and openly share knowledge. And this is against what the yoga texts and gurus have taught for generations, because if you practice the incorrect practice that is not appropriate for you, you can harm yourself and you can harm other people. So that's why. And the other thing is, what's dominant in these in the places where there have been these incidents of sexual harassment is that the Western capitalistic frameworks have dominated and not the yogic ones, right? They're selling products and they're selling yoga classes, some of them are actually Hindu lineages that this has happened. But when you see the way that they're interacting and they exist, they're still dominating in the capitalistic Western frame. They're not coming at it from the yogic frame, the Hindu frame. So if we can restore to some level or move towards the yogic pedagogy and yogic ways of passing knowledge, then we can actually reduce these these things, because yoga itself doesn't actually discriminate based on identity, right? So that's also the idea that Hindus are hoarding knowledge comes into play. Like, their idea is that we Hindus are trying to hoard knowledge, and what they're doing with post lineage yoga is saving yoga for the world, and they're like giving it to everybody. They're the ones who are like giving access to yoga. So that really is dominant, where Hindu gurus have never hoarded yoga. When people have come to them sincerely and asked them, they have guided them. And even when like white folks, right, who were British people, went and wanted to learn yoga, like Sister Nivedita, they were openly welcome, because that was someone who was a sincere seeker. So that aspect is being lost, and they're essentially telling that Hindu gurus are bad and they are hoarding knowledge, and post lineage is going to save that for the world. But that really means, because the dominant system in the world is the Western system, it's going to be owned by the West.
So, one question that comes up a lot is, I know I've heard it asked several times, is why yoga gets so appropriated, and people are, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry which refuses to even acknowledge its roots, like you showed. But then we have other traditions that are popular, that look similar on the face of it, like Tai-Chi, for example, right? And there are a lot of people who appreciate it, and practice it, but it doesn't get co-opted, or at least not. I haven't seen it get co-opted the way yoga does so far. I haven't seen beer Tai Chi or goat Tai, or whatever, or the fact that Tai Chi has doesn't is not Chinese in origin. Why have they been able to shepherd their tradition and we haven't?
I think that's my sense is that it comes down to history. If you look at Indian history, Hindu history, we've been like colonized. We experienced like imperial colonization directly. And while the Chinese experienced 100 years of humiliation, it was mostly, if I understand their history, it's like mostly a few ports that were taken over, and they were then, of course, forced to like take opium and forced to trade tea and all that. But Indian history is very different from Chinese history. We had a much deeper colonization than the Chinese did. And actually, if you look at like the Malay traditions too, they suffered a lot of, in Indonesian tradition, they suffered a lot of very deep colonization, and you see very similar trends with that. So wherever you have like settler colonialism, imperialistic colonization, you will see the most amount of appropriation of culture. And you see that with like the indigenous Turtle Island people, Native Americans, as well. A lot of appropriation of their traditions. You see like teens have like the images of like Native Americans, right, um, as their mascots and stuff. Meanwhile, like they're literally settlers in that area. So yeah,
Yeah.
that we have to acknowledge the difference in history.
Yeah, I think it's a very good reminder. Like you mentioned the Criminal Tribes Act, you mentioned colonization, and I think we're so caught up in our day-to-day lives that we forget the long arc of history and the impact it continues to have. So I think and I think again the important work of decolonization that really needs to be done in a more strategic, institutional way, hopefully. Um, so I guess there's a lot of questions, but I have one more before I go to audience questions. So I think your presentation touched on this. Yoga seems to be okay and accepted only when it's stripped of Hinduism, and we see this play out in so many ways. The terrible Alabama law passed last year being one of them, only one of them. And then I think there are any number of dharmic practitioners who have complained about being not being allowed to even use simple things like om namaste, and of course how most of us, even of Indian origin, tend to identify more with the English words that describe yogic positions, versus so the lotus posture versus padmasana or something like that. So um how can we tackle this issue? Because what is really a good choice? Should we just say don't do yoga because you are not going to call it the correct way and so lose out the benefits? Like, how do we unpack this? Because we don't want to be seen as hoarding it, but we don't want it to be completely disassociated from us and in fact even turned against us in some cases as is happening. So where does that right balance lie? I think it's a daily struggle for me.
Right. I think if you're in a corporate space, for example, many corporations now have diversity and inclusion initiatives, and they're flush with money. So I would participate and show up and make the case that in many of these spaces, there's a lot of recognition that, for example, Indigenous people of this land their traditions need to be recognized and they're the roots of those things that they are benefited from. Like, for example, burning sage has to be recognized as rooted in those Indigenous traditions. So And then you also see they'll recognize, Islamic practices, they'll recognize Buddhist practices. So we really need to go and make the case that they need to recognize Hindu practices. And that's also part of the diversity and inclusion. We are also part of that. It's basically like, it's not enough to just say South Asian. You have to actually recognize the Hindu gurus who came and did that. And that's also equity and justice. We need to make that consistently. So people in corporate America, when you see like AAPI initiatives, I would, try and go and include ourselves in that and participate. And then the other thing is we could just be raising awareness within the community. We should be teaching this to our kids, in an age appropriate manner, obviously, but we should be talking to them. Look, you're going to come across things and it's going to seem weird because I'm teaching you yoga one way at home and they're going to tell you yoga is about fitness or this or that. Or I think there was an NPR article that was like, namaste does not mean I bow to you. It's just a hello. And I was like, no. Namaste actually means I bow to the divine in you. And so we need to be continuously teaching our kids that you're going to come across certain things in the Western media, in your classroom, about yoga and your traditions. And you're going to need to be, discerning about that. Yeah, I think that's like a basic starter. And then once we can start developing these resources to go and continuously advocate for ourselves, we should do that. And in all these spaces, in interfaith spaces, corporate D&I spaces, schools, board meetings, school board meetings, all of that. So that's the only way to like kind of come out of this, essentially.
Yeah, there's a comment here that says Native American tribes are taking back their names, symbols, sacred spaces as a matter of social justice. Hindus need to do the same. I couldn't agree more. And, ultimately, I think we have to, here at CoHNA, since we are sort of a grassroots advocacy group, this is what we are always telling people is like, you're not going to have a savior come and save you. That you have to fight these battles. If it's important, you have to fight for it, and you have to make sure that you understand it, your kids understand it, and everybody around you understands it. And the more of us that do this, the better it becomes, the more believable it becomes, the more of a movement it takes. So shout out to everyone who's doing it, and we hope others get encouraged because right, like you said, there is a big trend in diversity spaces, and it often feels counterintuitive that something that has diversity in its charter then goes to try and exclude something that has very defined lineages and names, like yoga has a name, it has a pedagogy, it has a place of origin, and to try and wipe all of that out with some of this new terminology that we see doesn't seem very diverse at all. It seems like continuing the best traditions of the history of wiping out yoga that you outlined in your slides, the historical part of your slides. So let's look at some of the other questions that came in. So, let's take this one. So in the US, how does one go about identifying a good guru, one with the appropriate training and lineage? I think this is a practical one another practical one that we all struggle with a lot because it's so convenient. Your employer offers a yoga class, your gym offers a yoga class, your city offers something in the park,
So me and Indu Vishwanathan did a really great presentation on pedagogy of yoga, which answers that exact question in a way as to what exactly is a true guru and how to identify that. And that presentation is up on the Understanding Hinduphobia YouTube page. So I recommend people to go and watch that. But as a short answer, your guru or your lineage should be modeling, yogic values, which is devotion, non-egotism, all those things. And also I would just, when a teacher comes to your corporate space or school space, ask them, is this person lineaged? What is their lineage? Can they tell me who their guru is? If they're not able to answer that, then I would like say that you should, maybe go back to your the head of that diversity inclusion, initiative and say, hey, this is not okay. You need to get a lineage person. Obviously it's okay. When we say yoga is Hindu, what we mean is Hindus stewarded yoga for thousands of years. So we should just recognize that. It's not an exclusionary statement, but they'll read it that way. So be prepared for that. Be prepared to answer that question, right? Because our tradition isn't exclusionary. It's very inclusionary, but we don't proselytize. We don't say you have to be a certain way in order to, you have to like accept this God or that God in order to have access to these things. So I think that case we need to make. Yeah.
Right. And I think sort of following up on that one, this was one of the first questions that got asked, and I expected it to get asked. But it's like, how do we stop the commodification of yoga in the West and also in India, right? I mean, we can't pretend this is not a problem. This is not a problem just of the West or of a certain race. It's happening everywhere.
So that's like the whole pie. We really need to understand capitalism as something. Many Hindus don't understand that capitalism is not free markets. Free markets have existed much before and will exist after capitalism. Capitalism is a system of extraction that the Europeans created to extract labor from their colonies, in the way that East India Company did. Right? They extracted. They created a monopoly. They deindustrialized India so that they could industrialize Britain. So that's what it is. So we as Hindus need to go and figure out how we can protect our systems in a very systematic way, and recognize that capitalism isn't going to go away. It's going to be part of the ethos for until we can really decolonize. This is a long project. This is like decades, maybe generations. So we will need to understand that this is happening and then figure out ways to protect our lineages. That could be in forms of some kind of IRBs, which essentially say, hey, if you're going to talk about a practice that I taught you, you need to make sure that you're representing it correctly. And then I want the lineage will review it essentially. So we need to figure out all the mechanisms that are available to us to protect it within the current system. And then we need to work towards moving towards a more indigenous Hindu way of being and doing for a larger audience. I mean, there's all sorts of things, right? There's like environmental justice, there's economic justice, all these things Hindus have something to say about, and not just yoga. I mean, yoga is like a really big part of that. So we need to really move towards our own epistemic frameworks to really decolonize. And that's the only way to even like fully protect our traditions from being commodified. But until then, we'll need to figure out other ways and means to do that. And there exists. There's like ways the UN does it. Indigenous people in settler colonial countries like the US do it. There's all sorts of mechanisms. So we need to like go and develop those and learn from those traditions.
You mentioned the term IRB. What is that?
I'm sorry. The acronym kind of skips my.
Okay, but like, what is it? Is it like an educational, like, is it something you do in a school system or?
It's called an institutional review board. And basically every institution, so every lineage will come up with a set of guidelines, rules, where if they're covered, let's say somebody's talking about CoHNA tomorrow in the news, CoHNA can say, we have an IRB and nobody came and like filled out this IRB when they were when they were talking about us. So that's not okay. And this IRB, you can actually file it with the government. It's actually a really great tool. Native Americans actually do this so that anytime they're covered by Nature or the Science magazine, they have to go through a review with the that indigenous group and make so that, and then the indigenous group makes sure that they're being covered fairly. So every lineage, every Hindu advocacy group, like maybe groups of temples can create these, institutional review boards, file them with the United States government, and then anytime they're miscovered, they can say, "Hey, why you didn't do this?" So that's one way of protecting it, right? Where that's a defensive mode, but it's needed. We need that. And then let's say somebody is taking Ashtanga practice, that is yoga, and teaching it the wrong way or not honoring the guru or something like that, then that lineage can say, hey, this is Ashtanga practice and you didn't represent it correctly. So, that's a tool in the box that we can use.
Interesting. I think that answers one of the follow-on questions I was going to bring up, which was what can Sanatani Hindus do to sort of put some more guardrails and help protect this process a little bit more. So IRBs is one, but I think the Native Americans are obviously a very good example of folks to learn from. Are there other groups, do you think, that have done some work that can be used as a template in terms of protecting traditions, native traditions?
Yeah, I think the Maori have done a really great job for advocating for themselves at the local level as well as at the UN level. So we should definitely study them. One thing that was interesting to me was that recently they got approval for the universities, right? The Western universities that were only teaching science to teach their indigenous knowledge tradition as a science. So I found that process fascinating. There was a lot of Western scientists who were against it, but they were like, well, this is not a positivist tradition, and it's still valid. So they continuously made that tradition. So now the institutions in New Zealand have, certain institutions have like a degree in Maori indigenous sciences. So that sort of thing we can do. And we should learn, and it might be different in the United States, but in places where we can, we should do that.
Yeah, I keep going back to what your slides showed us, and in the terms of like how there's now an actual law, and then there are policies and other places that don't allow a yoga practitioner to actually use the terms he or she might have grown up learning. I'm wondering why that hasn't even been challenged just from a free speech perspective, right? I mean, in California, we're caught up in a we're caught up in a battle on words around the swastika, and it's funny, right? When people take away the Sanskrit words from yoga, the earliest excuse used was it's too difficult. All these, Padmasana and Bhujangasana. Oh my God, who can learn so much Sanskrit, right? But they did the exact opposite on the swastika issue in the 40s when they turned Hakim Cruise into swastika instead of hooked cross. Would have been much easier for the population at the time in a pre-internet era to have done that. So it's interesting how the language changes always seem to go with their trends.
It's beneficial for them, yeah.
Sorry?
Whatever is
Yeah.
more beneficial to them.
Yeah, totally. But now you have a weird situation where an Alabama practitioner, even if they wanted to teach yoga in a dharmic way, cannot do that. Even if they know it, they cannot start a class with an om or call it the correct positions. And I'm wondering what happens if if a kid asks about the name, what are they supposed to say? Are they supposed to lie and say, oh, this just came up one day in our wonderful land, and we call it downward dog forever. There's no history about it.
Well, I don't know how Alabama's solving it, but I think the way that they're framing it is secularism, right? So what they're saying is that they cannot have religion in schools, public schools. So it doesn't even come into a free speech issue because obviously, like Christians, I mean, they're not supposed to be able to do this, go in and preach the Bible, right? So they're framing it as a secularism issue. And I think even and the other thing that the corporate people are doing, and of course in a corporate situation you don't actually have free speech because it's a private, entity. So they're saying that they want to offer it to all of their employees. And in order to do that, they need to make it secular. So we need to understand like the way that the secularism is framed within the US. And the problem is that they still want to keep our practices, but they want to secularize it. So they want to take away all the religious aspects of it, except that asana is not asana unless it's done a certain way. And that theory, right, the reason that you do an asana a certain way is to actually move your prana or remove blockages in your panchakosha a certain way. So that theory comes from Hinduism. Hindus formulated that. So in that manner, our tradition is not really a religion, though it has very sincere beliefs. So it is a religion that way, but there's like a bigger world there that they don't acknowledge, that ours is more than a religion. It's a knowledge tradition, and it has all these aspects of it. So all of that, when they sort of formulate us as a religion, they toss all of our knowledge, all of our science, right, all that theory into that religion category, and then they exclude it. So we need to figure out a way to protect ourselves in this secular framing. So that's really what we need to unpack. And the thing I've concluded is that if you want to be in a secular institution and they can't take in something that's religion, then we need to say, then don't call it yoga anymore. Call it stretching, call it whatever, but don't call it yoga because
whatever.
Yoga
call it whatever you claim it is, right? Because there's all these weird theories about yoga is calisthenics or yoga is, so well, then call it calisthenics. Why don't you do that? Why do you call it yoga if you insist on saying it has nothing to do with Hinduism? Yoga is a Sanskrit word with a very definite meaning. So call it stretching, call it whatever, and nobody will care. I think it's a perfect example of how you want to basically have your cake and eat it too, as the old as the old saying went.
Yeah, and we have to understand, just to go back to the secularism point, we need to understand that secularism is okay with proselytizing, and it gives you some freedom of religion. So it's generally a framework that we can at least work with, but it doesn't give you the protection of your knowledge tradition. It doesn't give you protection from conversion. So in that way, it's actually, anti-indigenous. So we need to learn how the indigenous people have sort of managed this part of being being essentially forced to be part of this larger Western context.
Yeah.
So that's really, we need to understand that as a culture.
No, and it's interesting, like the corporate example, right? So even though the apps, that all these popular wellness apps don't call it yoga, when people try to explain what these apps are doing, they tend to default, maybe not in the official descriptions because that is obviously legally vetted, etc. But when a layperson is trying to explain what these apps do, they do end up coming back to use dharmic words, like yoga and like dhyan and all these things. So it's like it just shows you how much of a challenge it is to really decouple this from its roots while still retaining, if you still want to keep the influence or the benefits that it had. So anyways, I think we're over the hour. Are there any key messages or things you want the audience to think about or leave with as we embark on yet another year, another International Yoga Day coming up? I know that's not your favorite, but it's a good touch point as any to think about what is it that we can do differently in the coming year or coming years that we haven't been able to do in the past few years?
So I'm actually, I actually think that International Yoga Day is a good time to think about how we're going to protect our knowledge tradition. And I see actually the fact that it exists has actually brought yoga into the consciousness of many Hindus. So for that, I'm actually thankful. And many Hindus have like turned to, oh, we need to protect this because it's on their consciousness. They're like, oh, I don't want to learn this in the wrong way. So I think what people can do is, try advocating for yoga, its roots, to be taught in the, lineage manner, which is appropriate, and uphold yoga's pedagogy in spaces where they have the opportunity to do that. So I think that is the only thing I can, I think that's gonna, if we can just do that consistently as a community, I think that would be really powerful. And obviously, if people want to, reach out to me, talk to me, you can come to my group called Hindus for Decolonization. The link is up. And also you can email me on my email. So it's sneha@gmail.com. So, yeah.
Yeah, let's make sure we put up Snehaji's email so that folks can reach out to her for further questions or thoughts. And as she said, she runs a very popular group called Hindus for Decolonization. It's on Facebook, and if you Google it or if you search for it on Facebook, you'll find it. She mentioned it might be going through a rebranding, but I'm sure, we will still be able to find it in the world of the internet. Nothing can really be hidden. So I wanted to take this time really to thank you for your time. This was very educational. And I hope that you and scholars like you will develop on some of these threads that you mentioned today. As I mentioned, I'm particularly interested in the thought you were sharing with us about the impact of yoga, these kind of exercises when it's done without the holistic dharmic framework in which everything originated. So, really want to thank you for your time, for the wonderful information and the slides that you shared, and wishing everybody the very best. Namaste and Om.
Namaste.